Thank you all for coming this afternoon. It's Friday. Any cheers for Friday? Yes, cheers for Friday. Thanks for coming. This is the first of 3 events we're going to do like this. As you can see, we have some presenters, we have some respondents. The idea for this, and I think we talked a little bit about this earlier in the year. The idea is right now, if you kind of look out into the world of architecture speculation and criticism, if you look, for example, at the most recent Architecture Biennale curated by Rem Koolhaas, it's called Fundamentals. There's a lot of interest right now in returning to what people imagine is the core of architecture. What are the fundamentals? What's the essence of architecture? What we wanted to do is ask these presenters and then ask you to think about what they say and ask questions. If that's the right thing to be asking now, is our fundamentals a return to something conservative? Is it important to be asking what is architecture today? Should we instead be asking what can architecture do? Lots of questions to ask. So we're gonna start this evening, or we're gonna start with presentations, response, and then we have some questions actually that were posed by the graduate students. This event is, as I said, is part of 3, but it's also part of a larger, I think, it's part of the lecture series. It's also part of some symposia we're doing this year. Some of the questions are very similar. Tonight, we're going to talk about Precedent, and we're going to have, we'll have a moderator come here in just a second. I'm not going to say anything more about it, except thank you for coming. I'm looking forward to the presentations. Tonight, this will be moderated by the graduate program chair, Jean-Francois Bidard, who has his moderating jacket on tonight. Yes.
I'm moderating for bracelets.
He's moderating for bracelets. 2 presentations, one by Professor Kyle Miller, and the other by Professor Larry Davis. Respondents are Professor Anne Munly and Professor Fei Wang. And I will just give it to you. I get to ask questions as well if I give the microphone out. So I'm going to give it over to Jean-Francois. He will get this started. I'm looking forward to the discussion. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Michael. Well, this is a great turnout. We're very happy. It was worth it to spend some money on the carpet. So as Michael said, it's a series of 3 events, and we really urge you to attend the 2 other ones, which will be on the 3rd of October, Friday night, same time, and the 10th of October. The second event will be about theory, and the 3rd event will be about the relationship of fundamentals to politics. Just to maybe add to what Michael said, this is also part of a graduate research seminar, something we do in the graduate school every year, which is a year-long research seminar. Last year we talked about speculative realism, and there'll be an exhibition in New York on the 26th of September about the work that graduate students did last year. This year we're dealing with fundamentals. So it's the same structure, a seminar which is mostly reading and presentations in the fall, and then workshops in the spring with an exhibition and publication later. So the format, Michael explained the format. We have in the first row the graduate students that are part of the seminar, and I thank them for their quick response to the readings, and they formulated also questions. Of course, any question from the audience will be welcomed, and from the dean, right? So let's get started. You know all the professors. Please start, Kyle.
Sure. Okay. Thanks everybody for coming. It's fantastic to see so many people here. It's also quite terrifying. We have a lot of ground to cover, and as Larry and I were discussing earlier, any one of the terms that we're going to be introducing and using as a kind of foundation to build our position and potentially an argument on could really be an entire course. But I'm going to try and start with a couple of definitions, moving into what I'm calling positions and then provocations. See what I did here?
No, it's a disease.
Yeah, it's a disease. So I'm going to start with grammar. In architecture, the composition of fundamental elements in architecture can be considered grammar. For me, that was a nice way to quickly turn attention away from necessarily the fundamental elements by which a good portion of the Biennale was focused on and move to grammar. So of course, as was introduced by the Dean, the seminar has a loose affiliation to fundamentals, the topic of the Biennale. And the Biennale then is organized around these 15 fundamentals that REM identifies as the most significant elements within architecture. Eisenman's critique of that, though, is that the elements are quite different than grammar. And any language is grammar, he says. So if architecture is to be considered a language, elements don't matter. So for me, what's purposely missing is the grammatic. Eisenman also traces this back to Koolhaas's days at the AA. He dropped out because they weren't teaching him fundamentals. So this was maybe his way of getting back at a lot of people all at the same time. For me, grammar then yields precedence. Elements by themselves would not yield precedence because they would exist in isolation. Precedent then is an earlier event or action that is regarded as an example or a guide to be considered in subsequent similar circumstances. And I think precedent, of course, given the title of the talk, is the most key term tonight. What it does is it implies that something exists and that something relatively similar is attempting to exist. That might be an all right way to look at it. For the purposes of the presentation that I'm making, I'm equating precedent to history. I'm defining then history or precedent as a collection of architectural artifacts, ideas, narratives, and texts, and any of those things can serve as precedents for new work. For me, the precedent helps to define the project, but equally important is that the project helps to redefine the precedent. Tyranny is not tyranny without Eisenman. Another important key term that we've talked about is typology. Many people have written about typology. We were looking at the word through the lens of Rossi and Vidler, and Quattremere, De Quincey. I think that's something that I'd like to rehearse quickly is Rossi's speculation on typology, which is introduced in the initial writings contained within the architecture of the city. He talks about history and type and typology as something that become the kind of essence of architecture, certainly with typology. And he also seeks to make a distinction between type and model. Type is kind of the thing that becomes most reduced or most simplified as a basis by which other things can evolve. It also is quite different than a model, which is maybe more precise and potentially more prescriptive. In either case, he says that these things are prearranged but still unforeseeable, meaning that they're not just methods to classify and categorize things, but actually instruments. So then grammar yields precedent, yields typology. Typology enables us to choose our precedents wisely. It gives us a kind of base body of knowledge that's organized in some fashion that allows us to kind of choose where we might begin or what precedent we might select. Hopefully that helps to set some ground for the terminology that we're using and how it might come up while I'm developing these positions, and more specifically the relationship between the precedent and the project. So this came up at the lecture on Tuesday from Thomas Kelly, where looking at his work, there's a kind of interesting relationship between what you're looking at and what that work might refer to. So in postmodernism, we understand that it's that, not this. There's a signifier and a signified, and the building is meant to be read and thereby refers to something else. In the project that I was introduced to during my graduate studies, it reversed, and it was this, not that. And that's the Affect and Sensation project, where there's an emphasis on the here and now and the qualities that are produced in any given project outside of what it may refer to or what it might insinuate. I think the moment that we're moving into now, or at least the one that I hope we're moving into, is this and that, which is double coding plus, or maybe triple coding. I think some people might understand the postmodern project to also, in a way, borrow a bit of this in terms of both and. But the argument I'd like to make to differentiate the two is that once it becomes that, it's no longer this. So if mini megastructures are mostly ducts, they never return back to being mini megastructures. They stay ducts. And in this case, of course, the signifier becomes the signified. In the project of affect and sensation, there's an emphasis, as I stated, on the here and now, and there's a desire for non-cognitive, non-referential bodily sensations. And there's a quite direct avoidance of reference and precedent, really in service of the kind of experience, visual and sensorial, not necessarily cognitive. I think in more recent projects, there's a renewed interest in reference and association, but not one that turns attention away from what's being accomplished within the architectural project, and we can call that this and that. I think a good example that we can run through to demonstrate what that might mean is the recent project at the Biennale from Jimenez Lai representing Taiwan called Township of Domestic Parts. So in this and that, both form and space and precedent are visible in the project. And what I mean by form and space is that there's a project or there's a focal point that's not just about a reference. It's something about the form and the space that's in front of you. Along with that comes the reception of the project. It comes through presence and it comes through reference, with the goals being to advance disciplinary discussions on form and space and to engage others, which I think is something that postmodernism tried to do quite directly in response of the perceived failures of modernism. And once again, the target audience is not only architects, but architects and everyone else, plus architects again. And so this is the idea of triple coding, that there's an embedded architectural issue that's being worked on. It's demonstrated in the architectural output, as is the precedent that may have generated or inspired the work being conducted or being developed in that project, in addition to a kind of popular reference or anthropomorphism that seeks to engage a wider audience and directly attempts to avoid alienation. So if we look at Jimenez's project more closely, we can start to understand what this might mean. In the Garden of Earthly Delights, there's a direct reference to the structural components in the Slavin House from Greg Lynn in 2009. The top of this piece also pays homage to John Haydock with the crown. Outside of that, there's a very vibrant color field and a palette of shapes that I think are visually engaging to anyone without that disciplinary reference and knowledge. The House of Social Eating then refers quite directly to Venturi Scott Brown's Franklin Court, designed for the bicentennial celebration in 1976 in Philadelphia. The Altar of Appearance develops ideas about posture, where this piece quite specifically turns sideways, almost to give it a sense of something that one might find in Michelangelo's David, the contrapposta pose. And then in the House of Pleasure, a kind of update of foam sculptures from John Chamberlain. Again, each one of these projects internal to that project have their own kind of visual and physical ways of engaging anybody outside of their knowledge of the discipline. They also refer quite directly to things from history or precedents, and they also seek to advance maybe what Robert Sommel begins to introduce in his article, 12 Reasons to Get into Shape. So it's an evolution of the shape project in the sense that it's not about developing readily immediate shapes or figures, but it oscillates in between the two and attempts to kind of nestle somewhere in between what one might call loose fit figures or ambiguous figures. So along those lines, then, it might be interesting to speculate on appropriation and techniques of appropriation: the cover, the sample, the remix, the mashup. The cover is an almost copy. The sample borrows a portion of the original. The remix uses most of the pieces but differently. And the mashup puts two or more things together. We all know this example quite well. A copy of the Villa Savoy in Australia. Maybe a less known one, but equally awe-inspiring, is the copy of the Vatican Museum entry stair that can be found in the Guggenheim Museum. For the purposes of this argument, I'll say that the cover offers nothing new. That might not be entirely true. The sample then borrows particular elements from houses or from projects and includes them in new works. This is the Miller House from Jose Aubry, borrowing from someone that Aubry worked quite directly with, seen here at the Villa Chaudin from Corbusier about 40 years earlier. Coming back to Jimenez Lai then, this is his competition entry for the Louisville Children's Museum. If you haven't seen it already, the reference goes back to OMA's Agadir. Here you can see the image of the project being borrowed, the kind of figural profile that begins to line the edge, as well as the space-making strategy. So it's not simply a project of borrowing the image. So here in the plan from Lai, you see this idea that syncs up quite nicely with OMA's convention center, where there's this continuous landscape or urban room, as OMA would refer to it as. The sample pays homage and repositions. We could talk about the Vanna Venturi house through a number of ways. We could also talk about it as a remix, or sorry, as a mashup. But in terms of the remix, Venturi's using the familiar profile of the house, as well as classical principles found in the work of Palladio, symmetry, the pediment, and then also symmetry in the organization beyond the space. But here Venturi's breaks the pediment, includes an arch that's not complete, and then a lintel superimposed upon the arch, as well as breaks the symmetry of the windows. But by presenting the familiar figure of the house and the chimney, gives other people to engage with as well, despite their lack of knowledge about the disciplinary references. In Thomas Kelly and Kelly Baer's scene double competition entry for the Sukkah competition, they're developing a kind of narrative around these two figures, each which develops a particular posture and character based upon the way that their geometry is developed. This might be considered a remix of Hayduck's House of the Suicide and House of the Suicide Mother, which was his development of characters related to a poem that was written in commemoration of a student who passed away in a protest. Another example, a thesis project from Aaron Bessler a couple of years ago at SciArc was really working with the discrepancy between drawing and building and the gap that exists between those two. It was also a bit of a reflection on the missed opportunities that we now that are now on the table because of the precision with which technology translates buildings to forms. Of course, this is a remix of Eisenman's drawings, but with a little bit of a different dialogue. So in that sense, the remix reinvents. The mashup then brings two things together. Here we see the Villa de Lava from Rem Koolhaas in 1991. In his way, this is his way of kind of understanding how rhetoric begins to kind of turn modernist principles or even things that are associated with modernism on their head by using cheap materials and kind of dislodging the kind of associations that one might have with modernism. We know then quite directly it's the Villa Savoy on top of the glass house, or depending on the positioning of the sliding door, the Farnsworth house. More recent work conducted by Andrew Kovacs, a graduate of this program and a faculty member at UCLA, also considering the mashup here of what he calls architectural B-sides, or found objects discarded from the history of architecture. And here a speculation on reconstituting parts, hopefully for the sake of producing aesthetic experiences. And that happens through the defamiliarization of the things that are previously familiar. Finally, then moving into provocations, why precedent? The previous dominant mediums of avant-garde production have become cliché. In reading Vidler's essay, Architecture's Expanded Field from 2004, in which expansion was preferred and celebrated, we now might be able to position that expansion a bit more precisely. He identifies a few things in which architecture begins to kind of creep into. For what that yields are a couple of things that have, I think, since become cliché and leave little room for innovation as it pertains to experimental architecture. So digital technique plus biological paradigm equals gradated fields of fluid forms, otherwise known as parametricism. And the diagram to form model yields autonomous icons. Because of that, we've begun to assume the roles of others: landscape architects, urban planners, civil engineers, installation artists, and sculptors. As a result, in my opinion, we've gotten too far away from architecture. Other people begin to write about this idea about expansion or of disciplinary territory or of mediums that might be used for the production of architecture. It's easy to understand if you survey the work of, even the work being produced by the people included in the conference that I curated last year and helped to organize. It's no longer the fact that drawings and models lead to buildings, but in fact robots, rocks, knots, chairs, kites, puzzles, balloons, and toys lead to things that more closely resemble art and maybe more closely or maybe more appropriately belong in that discipline rather than architecture. That's not to say that they're not architectural and they're not worth using as drivers for the development of things more legible as buildings, but oftentimes they stay as robots, rocks, knots, chairs, kites, puzzles, balloons, and toys. So Sylvia Lavin, in her essay Confounding Mediums, and the one a couple of years before that in Log, celebrates this and promotes what she calls hooking up, or hooking up with other cultural players, and she calls this super architecture. What this yields is avant-garde architecture that is no longer about architecture. So what do we do about that? It's not that we return to history, but we can turn to history and return to precedent as a driving medium for production of architecture. And what this does is ensures the development and longevity of our discipline by really picking up things that are what one might identify as native to the discipline and making sure that they're rigorously and carefully evolved through the work of things legible as architecture. Therefore, in light of recent events, we must focus rather than digress, generate alternative medium specificities, and exhibit prudence over promiscuity. No more kissing. Thank you.
That was great. Hopefully I'll get the right distance here. I have 2 minutes. Okay. Okay, 2 minutes, 2 slides. That was great, and I particularly like the end, turning to history instead of returning to history. I think how you use history is critical to maybe this discussion today, and as we move forward and return to turning to history, I suppose. And maybe my role here is because I was wondering why I was here. Maybe because I'm more of an architect is the center of my identity, but also perhaps I represent a generation that had history in the center of their education. And in many ways, I was probably part of the reason we rejected it, because it was kind of, that's, history, nothing but history, and that's all you're allowed to do sometimes, which got to be annoying. Anyway, so blame me, or us. This is divided into 2 kind of segments. The first one's very short, sort of report, if you will, on the Biennale. I actually went, and thank you for the support from the school to make this report and sort of begin a line of research that I won't get into today, but it was really interesting. And these were 2 critical images or things at the beginning of the Italian Pavilion where Koolhaas and OMA had their big kind of exhibit that was incredibly impressive, exhausting. It was just never ended. And it was still, it was a very important kind of moment, a very impressive kind of thing. The first was this plywood version of the Maison Domino. I think the ribbon was there more to keep people off that because they were jumping up there. And the other was this dome at the entry with this hung ceiling and massive HVAC system. Both represented, I suppose, a kind of compromise, one a kind of almost postmodern interpretation of the Maison Domino, as if Venturi Scott Brown would have done the Maison Domino. And the other was a kind of perhaps consequence of what Koolhaas would call junk space, and on what we usually understand as regular space. So one was this kind of external object, the other was this internal object about 50 meters from each other, right near the entry of this thing. As was already told, there were these 15 elements that Koolhaas had and OMA had sort of broken the fundamentals down to, from windows to doors to stairs to toilets to, here's stairs and toilets. And it was a really kind of interesting way of, this is my picture of him. I was close by. I saw him. And everybody was like, there he is. And I was having a spritz, and there he was. And so you have doors, roofs, floors, toilets, walls, everything zebras. Everything was here. It was this kind of zoo of elements of architecture. But as it was already been pointed out by Eisenman and a lot of people that were there, that's actually where I first heard this, it was missing a major thing. It was missing a discussion about the relationships and how we actually put these things together. And what was called, as you so aptly put it, grammar. And not just, I would say, formal grammar. I would also say there's all kinds of other kinds of grammars or things that begin to create grammars. I just listed a few things that are also in this this book about architectural elements, or excuse me, relationships that came out by Val Wark and Andrea Simic, and they have a really nice list of these things. There are ephemeral things like space, light, scale, and movement, organizational devices like order, datum, grids, geometry, infrastructure, physical substance like mass and structure and surface and materials, conceptual devices like dialogue, transformation, and tropes. These are all ways of sort of creating relationships. And then, of course, cultural devices, and this is what I'm probably going to talk about most today. Context, program, natural environment is a very important one to us today. And, of course, history or precedent, very important. That's not to say that everybody avoided trying to develop and work with relationships. This is the Belgian Pavilion. They had amazingly abstract, austere, but beautiful kind of exhibit about line and surface as object in space, something dear to my heart. And this is the Spanish exhibit, where a typical example where you have these large photographs that you can see are folded there at the bottom left corner, and so that to try and recreate the sense of space of being in these 7 interiors, and then right behind you or in the adjacent surface in that room would be a giant section. So this was a pretty interesting statement. And of course, the one that we've already talked about, Emmanuel Lay's Township of Domestic Parts, is a pretty interesting example of something I think that goes beyond just looking at elements and tries to build relationships. I would argue another thing, I agree with just about everything he said about his pieces, but I would also say he was looking at how the insides of buildings look at the insides of our mind. There's a kind of psychological investigation going on here. That's, of course, very slippery to try and describe precisely because I'm not an expert in any of this. But if you look at the names of these houses are pretty interesting. And here is the panel discussion where he's sitting inside the social dining house. There's Anna Frank in the middle there. But there's the house of sleep, there's the house of pleasure, the house of study, the house of earthly delights, which is this thing that you had talked about relating to Hayek and Greg Lynn, work, house of alchemy, house of shit, and the altar of appearance. These brightly colored figures were put inside this actual palazzo that was really more than just a set of elements, but an attempt, I think, to understand social and psychological relationships. Changes, as you know, in social relationships frequently are in front of unconscious changes, I think, in space. People like Robin Evans talk about that in Figures, Doors, and Passages. It's a kind of subtle but very interesting arena of discussion. And it's also getting at what some people are calling this period beyond postmodernism, postmodernism, which I think we can get into later. That's a really complicated issue if we want to talk. This is the American Pavilion. Somebody asked me. It wasn't, it was okay. We haven't done a good job in the architecture one for a couple of biennales now. Or an impressive job, shall I say. Now, to the topic of precedent, which is really a discussion of history in disguise. As I said, I'm not really a historian or a theorist. I'm more coming at this as an architect who would maybe use precedent in a certain way in design, and also somebody who was educated in an era that embraced history. We would have these fights about, which is the best precedent, how should you use the precedent. One thing we didn't have a fight about is whether or not you should use it, because it was pretty much required. Of course, then when I got to grad school, by the time I got to the end of grad school, we were all talking about what's new and how is what you're doing new to architecture, and that's been the discussion now for the last 25 years. So it's kind of interesting now that we're starting to go look backwards again, and sort of beginning to ask, so how is your project like what's always been the same about architecture? That's kind of a reverse question that I find to be interesting. Still, I think there's some differences between the way you were describing the use of precedents and, let's say, I was weaned on, if you will, and maybe unconsciously still do this. I'm going to show some representative images. They're not necessarily the images that I think are important to directing my precise thinking and design or inspire me necessarily. I think they speak to the points. And these points are from a discussion we had with Anne and Kyle earlier in the week, and were, I think, really interesting ways of organizing maybe some of the ways, at least I was thinking about it. And the first I want to talk about is the relationship between image and space. I have always had a strong interest in space and spatial systems. The inside seems to have something to do with the outside somehow, not always exactly, but so you look at something like the Pantheon, and here is a building that we all know as an icon, but it's also an incredibly compelling space on the inside, a metaphysically compelling space, really. Not all space on the inside doesn't necessarily have to be that spectacular, but still there's this kind of interesting relationship. The next thing then is space's relationship to context, to understand how a spatial system needs to work holistically with relation to a larger sort of arena. So here the Pantheon and Munly plan is part of a spatial system, a kind of matrix, and this is, when you're using history and precedent, you have to understand then how this thing connected to what was around it. Very important. Again, I'm not necessarily advocating here, cities where the buildings touch each other. That's not necessarily what I mean by a city, but I'm talking about buildings that have relationships to each other and to other spaces. Connected to that is the relationship of context to autonomy. And again, Rossi was mentioned, and Rossi is a really interesting and was a pretty influential figure in my education, I think, because he emphasized the importance of the city, and as somebody who grew up in the suburbs, I had no clue what that meant, I thought. Later I was able to translate that a little bit. But cultural specificity of a city, of a given urban context, really does come into play. It allows this kind of idealization of a type, if you will, to adapt to the place and the specifics of the cultural norms of that place in a particular time, maybe even to a particular subgroup of that city. Of course, an object, a monument in the city could be interpreted by different constituencies in the city in different ways, but nonetheless, it's there. It's a kind of urban fact, if you will. So the dialogue between that urban fact, those objects, and the larger context is extremely important. And so what happens is one is very interested in its kind of situationness. The best built example of this, I think, was in the 80s by Rafael Mineo, this Museum of Archaeology in Merida in Spain. And again, it's a kind of typology, almost like a basilica, if you will, that's been deformed, distorted to, puzzle into the city that it's in, but also to speak to the program that it's about. And that is, lends a kind of richness, a kind of originality and use of history that is really fresh, I think, and isn't necessarily cliche and all that other stuff you were talking about. Then there's things like precedents and the difference between the discipline of history. Very quickly, architects, and in our discussion we were having earlier in the week, Anne used the word acquisitive, which I think is the first time I ever heard that word, but it's a great word. Thanks. And we acquire things that are useful, and if they're not useful, we sort of throw them away. Oh, I have to go quickly. Okay, so here's Paranasi. He acquires a series of Roman artifacts, but then he puts them together in this crazy way, in a very original way, okay? In a way that doesn't make sort of structural sense, if you will. The other thing about Paranasi is that Precedent can be both paper architecture and hard, built architecture. And so you could argue that the paper architecture, the books that we look at these things, are just as influential as the buildings. And we already talked about how Tarangi is a kind of descendant of the palazzo typology, the Strozzi typology, but has palazzo, but it also has an afterlife with Eisenman and his practice. The other thing I'm going to have to go quickly, but the other thing I think that's important here is the relationship between Precedent as a kind of technique, if you will, as a kind of specialization, and Precedent as a synthesis. As a specialization, there's a kind of danger that it becomes, it's very interesting, it's very important, but it's because it's quantifiable frequently. These specializations in architecture create their own kind of territory, their own political arena, in this case, the whole solar energy caucus, if you will, and can sometimes overwhelm and displace the ability for architecture to be a synthetic thing that can use history as a kind of synthetic device to create models for bringing things together. And again, this idea that architecture and architects are generalists is a very important thing, I think, to talk about. And these modes of strategic thinkings you find, again, in things like the four compositions, but also things like J.N.L. Duran in his précis in the early 19th century. Finally, this idea of technique and representation. Typically, we think of technique as a relationship to how we materialize the rhetoric of construction to represent cultural value and tell stories, make connections. Semper, a diagram of Semper on the left, on the right, Luigi Nervi, which is almost fabric-like use of concrete, but also a kind of reference to the first image I showed of the Pantheon. This is just up the road from the Pantheon at the Olympic boxing arena there in Rome. Finally, the idea of representation, and I'm going to use Jimenez Lay's work to talk about this. It tells stories. It tries to make connections. Again, as was mentioned, derivative of Hedek, Venturi, Scott Brown, Greg Lynn, Michelangelo, etc. It's less spatial than I would have imagined. It's definitely looking from the outside in. This is reinforced by the way he uses axonometric drawing. It's almost like he's looking at history as a series of objects, as a kind of acquisitive connoisseur. If you compare that with someone like Robert Adam or John Soane, who uses history through space, they're kind of connoisseurs or inquisitors of space, and very inventive with that, almost again like Mineo. So in the end, I guess my critique was of this work is that this was a plan, different ways of arranging those 9 houses. This is from the back of his book that recently came out. Is that I like this work. I think it tries to deal with sort of real world problems. We haven't been doing that for a while, I think. Often enough in terms of the kind of psychological relationship with the everyday. It's less ironic, less hip, less flipped, let's say, than the sort of traditional postmodern architects. But it lacks a kind of inside-out relationship. It lacks a kind of development of internal spatial relationship. And in my mind, architecture is really the art of occupation. That's a definition, again, from Robin Evans. And it tells how we intellectually and physically inhabit a space. It tells us that this is a fundamental way of defining what we do. Space gives us a kind of context. And so my question would be, to speak to what you were saying, was that is getting in shape really enough? Is making shape enough? Should we also be talking about how we make space and how we use precedent or whatever device we have to make sort of more effective spatial relationships. So that's it. Sorry, I went a little over. I thought so. I didn't know if I was going first or second, though.
Okay. You ready for this?
I don't know. Sure.
Okay. You know, maybe we have to assume for a moment that this really is a kind of trend and not just the next thing, and that it's not going to be gone in another 6 months or a year. And so if that's the case, I'm wondering about why now, what's at stake, and where is this going? And so I just want to, maybe this is really simple, but why do you think, you know, again, assuming this has got legs, this is important, we're going to be talking like this for years, what do you think is provoking this? Where is it coming from? Now, Larry, you may feel like it never left. Or maybe it left for a little while. Maybe it left for a little while, and an interest in, let's just say, putting back into architectural discourse some idea about the importance of precedent, about looking at precedents, about using precedents in work, about furthering architectural discourse through precedent. So assuming for a moment that somehow that left and now is back, and it's not just back for a few days, just quickly, how did that happen? Why?
I mean, I can give a quicker answer to it, sure.
Yeah.
I mean, this was never on the table for me, so for me it's incredibly new based upon where I was educated. I was just talking to Molly before I got started, and the only class that we really studied these houses was in the class that was teaching us Rhino. And in studio, instead of using architecture to make educated decisions about what our projects could be about, we were messing around with how to control how hair would flop around if a force was applied to it. And so, for me, I get
That's
quite,
cool.
That's, yeah, you would think.
do.
Yeah, for me, I guess I'm quite excited by what I perceive to be the timeless nature of this as a strategy. And I guess if I really think about it, it probably never went away for so many people, but for me, it's relatively new, and I think for many people trained in a school that was pursuing the digital project, that's the case.
Well, picking up on that then, and I don't know, Larry, if you wanted to add to that or just...
Well, I mean, I was never...
Yeah.
I mean, my use of history was never evangelical. My use of anything is never that way. I wasn't like, you know, you have to use history, otherwise we're, you know, just making some gross mistake. And the same thing about the computer or anything like that. I was always just curious. I mean, it's one reason I took this job was that it's open-ended. You just are able to work through questions and like this. But I think I did get to the point with the computer, like a lot of people, I was naturally fascinated when it came out, but that it wasn't necessarily helping me design buildings better. I was spending more time on the computer, learning the software, you know, and then some of the things I think that we were analyzing, I guess, stiff hair in the wind or something. I mean, after a while you have to say, well, that's an interesting phenomenon, but is it really helpful? And you know, it's a very kind of common sense way of looking at it. So I wouldn't say I was necessarily against that. I would just say, like, well, given the real estate you have in school, should you really spend your time doing that? Because it's so hard just to learn how to do a building in the first place. I mean, there's a lot to know.
Well, then,
to do it well enough, you know.
Let me swerve then into that second part, because that's just sort of assuming that there must be a why now. So what's at stake? Both of you brought up Aldo Rossi. Both of you, you know, referenced the architecture of the city, his classic work from the 60s. And I'm just wondering whether this idea of appropriation through precedent necessarily leads, like maybe Rossi would intimate, and perhaps you differ with this even as a reading, but to a kind of cultural specificity. Certainly he talks a lot about typology, but he also talks about an idea of permanences and a kind of specific nesting of those typologies with cultural specificity, I think. Or should I say, so let me see if I can rephrase this a little bit better. So does appropriation, or precedent appropriation, lead to cultural specificity? It's a good thing. Or is that just not even important? Is it more important to talk about internal dialogue, a kind of autonomous dialogue? That would be a reason why we're looking at precedents, and not really worry about something like cultural specificity. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
So,
Yeah, I would say not necessarily. I mean, you can look at typology and all that stuff without looking at cultural specificity. On the other hand, I think one of the thing that I took from him was his description of the background as well as the foreground of a city, and how the city can be understood as a kind of grammar, as a kind of context of events and form and things like that. I mean, Schumi was sort of talking about the same thing, not so much with form, but with events at the same time. And that you were plugging into this huge ecology of issues, social issues as well as physical issues. And that was really where the richness of architecture came from. So that's why space was very important, because that created this kind of theater where this stuff could play out somehow. And then if you took that seriously and arranged it right, you could create a more intense solution, more compelling solution somehow. That's what I took from that, and that it was important to understand that stuff autonomously, because everybody has to organize stuff in their mind, right? If you just know everything in a particular way, it's too much. But the autonomy were like letters, they were sort of places to condense your thinking, but then you had to distort those per the circumstance. I don't know if that answers your question, but.
Yeah, I mean, just along the lines of the relationship between cultural specificity and typology, you could almost have separate discussions about them, in the sense that typology could transcend any type of cultural context or political or social context. Rowe helped us to understand that, but I think the metrics by which cultural specificity could be achieved are maybe separate than typology playing into or aiding in cultural specificity. I think there's different ways in which you can be specific to culture and engage people, and there's specific ways in which you can play into the use of precedent and the evolution of a certain typology without that having to be one and the same discussion.
well, because I suspect that there's a real difference between you guys here, I'm just going to pick at this just one more time before let then Faye say something here. But I guess what I'm wondering is what's most at stake, right? So if in fact one is going out now, say, Kyle, you were talking about your generation and new material and excitement about the material and maybe passion and dedication and belief, whatever, is the goal to reinvigorate and maybe alter and direct the discourse within architecture, which sounds to me like, and I don't mean this in a negative way, but an internal discourse,
Yeah.
self-referential perhaps, or is it, and I think, I suspect, Larry, you may have a bit of a different sense about what's at stake ultimately at stake in terms of using precedent in your own design work. So,
Yeah, I mean, I think what's most at stake is the presence and legibility of a discipline that belongs to architecture. And I've grown to value that, because I think it allows the efforts to become grounded, empirical, specific, and rigorous. After a time in which there was such a diffused set of mediums used to produce architecture and such a diffused legibility of what one could call architecture, that I think this is a nice way to at least temporarily shrink or focus or isolate things that we can claim as our own and develop those the expertise necessary to make contributions to that discipline. And so for me, the kind of return to precedent and turning to history is a way that would ensure that. So I always like to think that my primary responsibility as an academic is to preserve the history of architecture and to speculate on the future. I think there's also in between that kind of application in the kind of present situation, but I think it's important in the academy that preservation occurs and that speculation occurs almost simultaneously, especially if precedent is what's being used to generate those speculations.
I don't, you're not gonna like, I don't necessarily disagree with that. I think architecture is a body of knowledge that we should know and take, and it's a fluid body of knowledge that we should take ownership and have some kind of authority about. I guess for me, the issue, you know, when I'm picking at some of these new uses of history is that they're getting it half right. They need to also talk about creating this space for social transactions to occur. And I'm not trying to sound like a sociologist and, you know, talking about, you know, the best shape of a table or something like that. I'm talking more about connecting to one of the, I think, primary stimulants to architecture. This autonomous thing then gets energized or distorts or transforms to speak to and have an engagement with this other stuff that's happening around it that's not architecture. Mm-hmm. And that, to me, you need to know architecture to, you know, by itself, but then you also have to know how, typically over time, how these things have interacted with that, so that when you come into your situation to design something, you can imagine that, oh, this thing will have the, you know, the firepower, the muscle to be able to address these other circumstances, and really be even more than the kind of almost, you know, autonomous digit that thing can be. But it's really important to know those things. I can't agree more, you know, but that's part of the job.
I have a few observations. I'm going to start with Picasso's saying, and he said, good artists steal, great artists, good artists imitate, great artists steal. So if you are just good, you just imitate somebody, we still can see you are imitating someone else. But if you are stealing, you steal the credit, and people don't see the original. And we see a lot of great architects, they learn a lot from the precedents, like Rem Koolhaas, still using a lot of Boulet's idea, and Le Corbusier's Domino system for his, the museum and the library many times. And Sejima, and her thesis was about Le Corbusier. You can see her, a lot of projects really use a lot of modernism ideas. And also Le Corbusier did a lot of research about Choisy and copied a lot of, even imitate all his previous books, trace by trace. And even I was thinking, I like history. Even go back to history, Philippe Delorme is a very interesting guy in 17th century. He did two drawings about good architect and bad architect in 1626. And bad architect, no eyes, blind, no hand. So it's trying to, whatever, wandering around just to find a way, blindly, without touching anything. But good architect has 4 hands, 3 eyes. And that's a very interesting drawing. I like that most. And he says just the good architect is always learning from the past, observing the present, anticipating the future in order to avert badness wherever possible. So we do learn from the past and go back to the fundamentals. And my thinking is, if we go back to history to see the word architect, what does it mean? Architect means master builder. Master builder. So that's the word origin to combine as one as an architect. But right now, we don't build. We build drawings, we build models. So that go back to the representation. And what's the core of architecture? What's the core of architect for us as architect, to be a good architect. So we have to learn a lot. That's why we have maybe a way to originally the architect shall be. So
You touched on something that was in one of the questions that Francois Bedard gave us about, that came from the students, and I got this, question 3, I got this sense there's a kind of nervousness about being original when you're using history. And, it's a tricky question. You look at Venturi's house and, what could be more sort of standard than a house, right? In that shape, it's like every kid's little drawing, but at the same time, there's a lot of, clever comments in there. But I think that this question of history now, and in this question, they asked something about, it seems to imply to me that, there's a novelty in using digital mediums, and, we'll never be, if we go to history, we won't be novel anymore. It seems to me that the digital mediums aren't getting to questions that you guys want to ask, right? That there might be, it helps you do certain things really well, really elegantly, actually, but there might be certain kind of cultural questions. When I'm looking at Jimenez Lay's stuff about, the inner mind of living in an urban Asian city, parametrics probably won't help you get to an answer there, right? That somehow that history might, or rethinking conventions, maybe the narratives embedded in conventions and how the space is connected to it might work. And I think, you're right. I mean, there's this huge wealth of examples there that you can use then to use the same process, perhaps, when you're looking at your problem in front of you to design something that's helpful.
For the benefit of the audience, maybe
I should read the question.
maybe the students can ask question number 3.
It was between the age of digital novelty and that.
They're going to ask. Yeah.
So the question we have was, between the age of digital novelty and that of digital augmentation, what is the relevance of precedent?
Is this one on? Yeah. I mean, I guess, I don't know if this will answer the question. I'll probably get around to it. But I think it's also important not to dismiss what the digital project has given us. I would say, as it pertains to contribution in practice, it's done this much so far. And so much is to be gained by pursuing advanced digital techniques geared towards design and production in practice. And even as it pertains to the academy, we don't have Mercedes-Benz Museum without the kind of pursuit of topological formalism and advanced technique. As it pertains to, let me see what this question is really asking. What is the relevance of precedent between the age of digital novelty and that of digital automation? So I think in between those two ways of classifying that project, precedent was more or less off the table, architectural precedent. Biological analogy was the replacement, and so there was all this kind of talk of genetics and evolution and things related to biology much more so than architecture. And that became the metric by which to evaluate the success of the architectural proposal, was how well it demonstrated genetic evolution or something like that. So I think to answer the question, architectural precedent might still contribute to the advancement of the digital project. In the latest log, in log 31, Emmanuel Petit, well, before I get to that, Greg Lynn's essay, Variations on the Row Complex, I think provides a very eloquent strategy for evolving Row's analysis of Korb and Palladio, and I think he did a nice job thinking about strategies of allowing variation and heterogeneity to be pursued without negating what, or in opposition to just identifying a kind of essential type or a singular type. And I think Petit now in log 31 does a nice job of saying we might want to revisit that essay again and rethink about the production of space given what's happened in the last 20 years in the digital project and the new ability we have to conceive of space in a completely different way than we did previously.
Yeah, you know, we're going to share this one, right? Okay. I think what you just said is really important, and I want to go back to Faye, that three eyeball, four-hand individual, and think about the three eyeballs. And what I don't know that image, but I know that there's an idea that the third eye is actually the window to the mind, right? And I think that building material will always surround us, and some of it's old. And so it's there. I think what's at stake here is how we take it in. So that third eye, I suppose, the mind at play with the eyeballs and the hands. And I think it's so important that what you just said about the fact that the digital project certainly just doesn't get erased or go away. So that's been mapped onto the discourse in such a way that I guess what I'm trying to get at is what differences might we see in the way that precedent is intended to be used or is seen as at all useful. And it strikes me that it's going to be different than in the 80s and maybe not have the same desires or goals. And I just have a question following up from the students. I just wonder whether the screen, the digital screen, that is that thing that we sit in front of all the time now, whether that has given us a propensity to use precedent through image, to sort of, how should I say, favor image, flattened image, as opposed to, I think, Larry, you were alluding earlier to something that was more synthetic and spatial. And I wonder what you all would think about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think the biggest issue is also the inaccessibility or illegibility of scale. I think that's probably the biggest issue in developing work only digitally. But I think along with that comes sacrifices on spatial development. And it's easy to generate a provocative image. It's less easy to generate a provocative space. And I think related to that, I wonder if you can prove that you've made or that you've done something successfully in space without building a project. Like, I think some of the discussions I've had with Larry in saying that the work falls short of advancing precedent through space, and maybe only as it pertains to form or the object. I don't know that you can actually prove that. Not you. I don't know that you can prove that you've done a nice job with making space without building the building. Like, you can prove the image of a project through representation, and you can prove, I think, in a much more easy way the successes as it pertains to form making. But space is really something that needs to be experienced at one-to-one. You can hint at what that proposal might be, and I think that also ties itself in a way to the digital medium.
Go back to your comments about the space and geometry and materiality. I'll give you one example, and I can think about perfect for this. Geometry, think about the word geometry. It's geometry, which means measurement of the earth, measurement of the land. That's the meaning of geometry. But right now, geometry can be anything. We don't have to really care about the materiality, physicality. So there's a really interesting example by Galileo Galilei on his book on two new sciences. He gave one example about the geometry, about if, our human bone is like this. So if there were a giant 3 times taller than our normal people, and the bone will be 3 times longer, but it shall be 10 times wider because of the physicality, the materiality of the bone. So we cannot just scale it just by the geometry. But 100 years later, Darcy Thompson on his on growth talk about a fish can turn into this kind of fish, or can turn into a horse, or a dinosaur, or a human being. Can be anything. Then Greg Ling and other, they use this example as a lot to just deal with the purely conceptual geometrical relationship. So go back to your comments. It's really, a lot of digital fabrication of digital media is really away from the physicality and materiality itself. If you see, go back to the Precedent, a lot of copied project. I mean, in China, over the world, if we copy the shape, we don't copy we don't know the essence, we don't know the materiality, we don't know the construction way. I mean, locally, we don't have the material, we don't have the technique, then it's disastrous. I mean, there are many examples in China. The Zaha Hadid's, the Guangzhou opera houses, it's really bad construction. But in the one in Azerbaijan and in Korea, they use really low tech, really normal cladding technique, but it works really well. But it's really the way, how can we deal with geometry is also we have to rethink about that in terms of the digital technology.
I was just going to say, just to speak to something that you said, Kyle, about how do you prove, if a spatial project is, successful or not. Sure, building it is the best. But I do think that in some cases, physical models can be really helpful. I mean, just like drawings, they're an approximation, And so, what's interesting to me is how models are made now with the computer, and that you have to draw it on a flat screen first, and then you make the model. Whereas in the old days, you would just make it out of chipboard or whatever you have there, and you would look at it and you would fix it and you would change it right there directly in 3 dimensions. And I think there's a big difference there. It's a difficult thing, I think, to make a model in 2 dimensions first and then hope it goes together. So what happens, you tend to sort of put together a series of images, almost like a Robert Adam, elevation on a room, and hope it comes together rather than actually getting your hands in. Now, you can use, Rhino and some of these other things in kind of 3 dimensions and get in there and fly through, but it's still on a 2-dimensional screen. There's something about that. I think you have a point there, Anne. I never really thought of it before, but that might be one of my sources of frustration with the computer.
I think we were going to go to the students right now because you had two or three questions. So are you guys ready to?
Hi, I'd like to ask, when Eisenman affirms that Koolhaas doesn't believe in grammar, does he apply that Koolhaas reject that grammar is topology, and grammar as a precedent or both, or architecture elements play the role in either of those? It's question number 1.
So what Eisenman said about Koolhaas's lack, I don't believe Eisenman actually. I think Koolhaas knows a lot about grammar. He doesn't talk about it. He makes the most exquisitely proportioned buildings, very interestingly put together, sometimes intentionally cheap, if you will. But I think, and he knows a lot about structure. I mean, and how it works with space. I think he never talks about it, and I'm curious as to why. He's much more eclectic, I think, than what Peter Eisenman would like, or is like him. Eisenman's much more sort of monochromatic. Yeah, he's promiscuous. He's provoking us. He's teasing us. He's almost a 3-dimensional version of Venturi, Scott Brown sometimes, I think. So I don't believe Eisenman.
I agree. Well, we believe him in some
About
aspects,
other things,
but
maybe,
not as it
not
pertains to Koolhaas rejecting those things.
Other questions?
Sure. All right, so we have a few questions from the category misuse, authorship, and appropriation. I think I'll ask the last 2 first, though. At what point does the precedent become misused? And does the misuse of precedent contribute to its autonomy?
I think that's a trick question.
Yeah. How are you defining misuse?
I was hoping you guys would define
He loves
your.
misuse.
It's a personal question, I guess.
When do you think it's misused? Or when have you seen like, oh, that's not the way you should use history? I'd be curious.
Well, I think the nature of the question stemmed from the issue of authorship and how architecture is kind of a unique profession in that, like, you know, in terms of like stealing specific aspects of historical precedents is accepted, and at what point, you know, is copying or referencing a precedent, like where is the line drawn, I guess, between when copying is acceptable and when, or is it acceptable in all cases, I guess is the question.
I would say, is it stealing or copying, or is it just doing something that's been done before better? That's how I would answer that question.
I think in that article that you're referencing in the other part of the question by Vidler, I think it's in that article that there's also a discussion about when something falls flat. In fact, it's that Adorno quote there, that if precedent starts to become used slavishly as just kind of an accepted norm in practice, I think what we experienced in the 19th century is that it was just kind of how should we say, it wasn't used as, actually it was used as image. So in that sense, I think there was an understanding that it was being misused, that there was a big reaction to that. And I wonder, it's a cool question in that sense, whether if precedent now is used primarily as image or image shifting or mixing, whether that would constitute that kind of, I don't know if misuse is the right word, but lack of depth, I guess, in terms of what it means for the profession or discourse.
And isn't that true with any kind of movement? The digital sort of got into a dead end, right? It was starting to be not used in a deep way anymore. And you could almost say that about any era or period, you know, and you sort of, you know, it just starts getting kind of, you know, we start getting reflexive and automatic, and that's when you
that's
kind
the
of
problem.
push and go to the next thing.
I mean, I think appropriation is actually quite necessary in terms of a technique, in the sense that most other cultural practices also, to some degree, copy and transform existing material to generate new material. I mean, some of the music you probably like most are partially sampled from other songs or remixes of songs that you may not even know. And I think a lot of artists count on appropriation as a technique to become generative for them. I always use the example of, borrowed from that video you guys might have watched, of Hunter S. Thompson rewriting The Great Gatsby just to see what it feels like to write a great novel, and Bob Dylan's first album being 11 cover songs. Like, and if you think of most significant inventions, they all rely on either partial appropriation of previous inventions or mashups of previous inventions in order to generate something new. And so I think we've been a bit shy to accept appropriation as a technique of production, whereas I think in fact it's quite the opposite, that we should rely on it to, again, ensure that we're making a kind of honest contribution to things that are relevant as deemed by others before us, and then have some solid ground to stand on in doing so. I think that was some of the shortcomings of what was perceived as novel in the digital project, is the fact that there was no sturdy ground to stand on within our own discipline, and that's why things like biology and philosophy, where people went to say that they were grounding their ideas.
You could argue that appropriating something makes what you want to say, you know, the original thing that you want to say, more accessible to more people and therefore more powerful. So you're using the same elements, but you're putting them together in a different way that speaks to, you know, some strong message that only you have seen, that you want to communicate to others. And by using something that's familiar to them, or more or less, you know, you get more people into your message. So it's not necessarily a bad thing, you know?
Yeah, few days ago, Kyle showed me his last year student thesis. Is a combination of Villa Savoye and Farnsworth House. That's very striking. That's the thesis. It's really interestingly to apply two architects' different points of view combined as one. It's really, the design is very exquisite. And just to go back to the project itself, if you think about at that moment, Philip Johnson and Mies, they almost designed Farnsworth House and Glass House almost the same time. And actually, Mies designed the Farnsworth House in about 1955. Then it was built in 51, roughly. And then Philip Johnson designed about 47, then built it in 49. Actually, he used the kind of idea. They had a lot of debates even before. Philip Johnson didn't believe you can build a totally transparent building, and they had a debate even at MoMA. And Mies designed it, and he saw it, then applied it. Then there was a lot of debates about who comes first. But if you go to these two buildings, they have really different response to the environment, to the program itself. So Glass House is part of a landscape. It's grounded. And Farnsworth House is just floating because it's on a flooding field. So, and also even in the interior organization, they respond to vernacular houses prototype too. And yes, it's very, very interesting. So it really, they might steal each other, whatever. So, and this week, my student in a coffee culture class, Jason, he talked about 5 different Villa Savoye. So black one, original one, and one under the freeway, and 2 upside downs in China. So something interesting, we say that the first upside down Villa Savoye might be the client saw Villa Savoye, and he was holding the book upside down, and he just copied it. And then another version is just like, he saw the upside down version, then he copied upside down version, then creating something new. And it's always just the misinterpretation can generate something more interesting, I mean, in certain way. And so lost in translation might be good.
Are there any questions from the audience? Yes.
We learned from the history, we use the precedents from history. I wonder, could you predict the precedents for the future from now? I mean, if the result is digital design, is there any other possible way
If I answer that question, I'm going to get in trouble. Like, what projects today would become canonical for the future?
I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, the only one that I was brave enough to mention was the Mercedes-Benz Museum. I think that did something pretty novel, and that's probably already served as a precedent for a lot of student work. But I actually think that the precedents for the future will be the precedents of the past, in the sense that some of them just won't go away. Probably a couple others get added in, but I'm not going to be brave enough to try and list a bunch of them right now.
I have a question about process, which came up in a conversation Anna and I had the other day about process and technique, and is it possible to really reference or use these precedents in the way that they were originally conceived of now, even imagining the digital project, and can you recreate postmodernism or even more traditional form of architecture using digital tools if the process is completely different? Or does that completely change the result, even if you're trying to copy the thing in the exact way? So how does process and technique make using precedents possible or not?
I guess I don't know that what digital technique enables changes the way, holistically, the way one might use precedent. I mean, putting a pencil down and doing that yields the same thing of clicking here and clicking there. But the degree to which a precedent can be transformed certainly has become expanded based upon what NURBS modeling enables, and probably that alone. Or just, but then you could say calculus, like the introduction of calculus probably changes that, because that's what a lot of those techniques are based on. But I don't know that it would holistically change the way that precedent is used, because yeah.
I think you know, the interesting question in the process is why you would use one or the other, or what are the kind of intentions about why you're using them. And so again, we look at Jimenez Lay's work, and you know, again, people are connecting it to, you know, the canonical postmodern works by Venturi, Scott Brown, Hayek, people like that. But you know, as much as he has a suspicious view of the present and the world now, I don't think he's not as directly influenced, let's say, by pop art and the sort of cleverness of it. I think he's actually trying to find something that's, in a weird way, sincere. I don't personally understand it so much because, but I kind of welcome it. You know, it reminds me of a lot of books I like these days that are written by some living authors, and this kind of search for a new narrative, a new way of puzzling life together again. So he's seeing how other people use things and maybe trying to put them together to tell stories. I mean, the idea of telling a story is kind of coming back into the picture, which I find is a kind of interesting, refreshing in some ways, because after a while I was having a hard time keeping up with this mathematic way of understanding information and stuff.
So I have a question that I think it bridges some of the things about REM and use of precedent and typology. And a lot of what you all discussed hovered around this issue of space making and spatial implications of design. So obviously, if you're looking at a precedent, you're looking at how does it inform your space. If you're looking at typology, that's directly spatial configurations. But in the era of bigness, according to REM, and where space usually comes from, which is a kind of sort of proportioning and compositional thing, which is in itself grammatical. If you look at REM, you would say that, well, space isn't grammatical anymore, meaning there are not as many rules to follow, perhaps, or no rules to follow. Is the precedent, as a result, even useful in the era of bigness? And more importantly, and this will probably get me kicked out of the grad program, but can architecture become a post-spatial or anti-spatial project?
Yes. It can, but you know, my point was, should it? Is that enough? I hope you're not satisfied. That would be my challenge to anyone that, you know, well, I don't need architecture with space. And I'd say, you're right, you can make, you know, a series of icons on the landscape, but I would say, you know, I would probably yawn. I'm like, that's kind of boring. Like, why are you avoiding one of the richest things that architecture can do, and you know, still be clever and all that kind of stuff? Because you know, space engages all these kind of things. That, but you're right. I mean, context, proportion, stuff like that in bigness was, what did he say? Fuck context, right? And you know, that was depressing to read, I have to say, for me.
I'll also answer the second one. If you get kicked out, Syrup will take you. I mean, I think there's many forms, as I tried to address in my topic, I think there's many territories that architecture has expanded into, and also many of which are aspatial. I think there's projects in architecture that are based purely on representation outside of any formal or spatial pursuit. I think there's architects and architecture that has become more like performance art. Certainly architecture that has become more like sculpture. And I think that's the part that's both liberating but also makes me anxious. Like if I want to make a contribution to architecture, at least for me, I only want to understand its relationship to previous acts of architecture and then have my output be legible as architecture. I think that's cleared a lot of space for others to expand the territories that they are maybe more comfortable operating in. But in my opinion, to a disservice of a kind of singular, robust discipline with shared values and shared standards and shared protocols.
Can I just ask you something based on that? Is this on? Yeah. So how does new material enter into that discourse?
That's the question?
Yeah, that's the question.
Well,
It's just
yeah,
a
yeah, yeah,
small
sure, sure.
one.
So I think someone that's done a nice job trying to rein in the expansion, and the expansion that they directly contributed to is Jason Payne, who writes quite directly about how he's very interested in formalism, the resurgence of formalism, and the return to the focus of the discipline. I should be looking at you. And he said he likes to step outside, borrow techniques from other disciplines, and then bring them back in, only to make architecture still autonomous in its pursuit. And so he was borrowing techniques from hairstyling as a way to reconsider the way that we might use thatch. That was a studio he ran at UCLA when I was there. And so that's a tough question. I mean, I think personally I've taken it to like an absurd level of isolation, just because for me that was a nice, hopefully a nice way to ground myself. I think that will eventually loosen up, as it might for many other people, as they become more comfortable with what they constitute to be a discipline. And then I think, of course, everything being cyclical, new source material will be sought out. But even those that are consciously seeking out source material kind of like go outside very quickly, steal some stuff and bring it back in, only to make sure it reinforms the way that they're developing formal and spatial proposals. Whereas I think for a long time, that second part was missing. It was go outside, borrow some extra architectural sources of influence, done. Little responsibility about how that might continue to more timeless or deep discussions about disciplinary issues.
So do all the types already exist?
These are hard questions, Anne. Probably not. Probably not. I mean, I think even, as I said earlier, the digital project allowed us to conceive of new spatial types.
It's really hard to invent a new one.
Sure.
I think it's possible, but it's like that's every, I don't know, like who knows? I mean, it's really every generation. It's
But
difficult.
yeah, I think
But you have to understand its influence. It has to have a legacy and inform things. Have this afterlife that you talk about. Because if it doesn't, then it doesn't really. I say I'm making a type. Yeah, prove it. Well, you have to wait 30 years to prove it, or whatever, to see if it has legs. Otherwise.
Final questions? Yes.
I think there's a certain importance of new disciplines to try to find new things, but I guess there's a sort of, I think that sort of implies an anxiety within the architecture that it's possible to make a new without new discipline. And so, I guess like a lot of the things that made architecture new were advancements in technology. So is there a way that maybe that would it be possible to create that sort of similar advancements within the sort of just central discipline of architecture without necessarily looking without this? Or is it only possible by looking out towards other technologies?
Well, if I understand your question right, is it possible to make new without using new digital technologies or any outside? Yeah, I mean that's kind of the point of precedentness, is that if you have is that a word? If you have a kind of original intention, something you see life in a kind of original way, you can use an older technique or an older thing, distorted, reconfigured, recontextualized, if you will, to say something very, fresh, original, powerful, what have you. I think that's possible. I mean, that was what your point was about music, too, I
Sure,
think.
yeah. I mean, I think it also depends on what you deem to be novel and new, and sometimes rhetoric is all you need to change the way that something is perceived, and then it can be perceived as new and novel. I mean, I think that's what's happening now. I don't want to say this and have it open up a can of worms, but I think that's in a way what's happening now with the borrowing of object-oriented ontology onto formalism, or as a way to advance formalism and the relationship of person to building. The images remain the same, the techniques remain the same, the rhetoric has changed, and it's produced something new. And so I think it is quite possible. Well, in that case, that goes counter to your argument. It's borrowing philosophy. To answer your question, though, I think it is quite possible, just because of the way that Rossi has helped us conceive of typology as an instrument of itself, and he says it helps the autonomous researcher. So it's probably impossible to not even be subconsciously influenced by outside sources, but I think if there's a conscious effort to make advances only by sourcing your own discipline, I think it's entirely possible.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.